everyone, and welcome to my talk. Today we're going to be speaking about getting started with motion layout in Android Studio. So we're going to be diving into using the motion editor and just exactly how you can get started and the basics of motion layout. So don't worry if you haven't used motion layout before, because hopefully by the end of this session, you'll have a good understanding of how to get started and how to make your apps have great animations inside them. So let's get started. So, for those that don't know me, my name is Rebecca Franks, and you can find me on the internet at Rigaroo. And I've been doing Android for quite some time now, and I've taken a particular focus and excitement towards looking at things like constraint layout and now obviously looking at motion layout. So you might have watched one of my videos before, and one of them that is actually covering constraint layout quite in depth, which I recommend watching if you haven't dived into constraint layout at all, because motion layout assumes a base knowledge of constraint layout. So if you're just starting out, maybe perhaps check out constraint layout first, and then come back to this motion layout video to learn a little bit more about how to animate with motion layout. So what exactly is motion layout? So motion layout is a subclass of constraint layout. So everything that you can do in constraint layout, you can do in motion layout. So if you're using barriers, or you're using chains, or you're using just constraints that are part of constraint layout, they will work and be used in motion layout. And motion layout allows you to have additional ways to animate your views on screen. So we're used to looking at different ways, such as looking at our transition managers or looking at just simple view animations that we have been using before. But motion layout aims to take and use complex and be used for complex view animations that are driven by interactions. So things such as dragging on a recycler view, or touching on a button and moving a whole bunch of views at once in different directions and different things happening at the same time. So it's more for like a whole complete scene that you're transitioning, and not just like an individual item that you're transitioning with. And my personal favorite is that motion layout is actually really, really nice to use, whereas a lot of the other animation frameworks can be a little bit tricky and take a little bit more learning. But from my experience with motion layout, it's a lot easier to work with and a lot nicer to work with as well. And also, one of the nice parts about motion layout is that it allows for midway seeking of animations. So if you have, for instance, an animation that at 50% of it has some like very useful state that it has, you can sort of seek to that 50% mark and make sure that that is what you want to display on screen. Whereas with some other animations, they're what we call fire and forget animations. So that means that once you start it, you can't stop it or seek to a certain position of the animation. You kind of just have to wait for it to finish and wait for it to do its thing. So motion layout has that advantage of allowing you to seek in that animation itself. Another nice thing is that motion layout is backported to API level 14, which should cover most use cases. If you're using anything lower than that, I feel sorry for you, and my condolences. I hope things get better. But anything other than API 14, and you should be good. So this is some example usages of motion layout. So the first one is a example of a really nice like filtering scenario that I believe was taken from Dribble, and this person has taken it and implemented it in motion layout and actually written up a whole great article about how they used it. So I would definitely recommend checking out that one. And then the other one on the slide is from the app that I work on every day, Over, and you can see on the subscription screen we have this animation of like all these elements coming together and this sort of bounce up and down animation at the end of that little like section. So both of these were accomplished with motion layout and the different features within motion layout. Some a little bit more complex than others, but hopefully by the end of the session, you can do like basic animations with motion layout and just like get to that part where you want to be able to make more and more different complex animations and use the different features of it. So let's talk about how you would get started with motion layout. So the first thing that you want to do, or make sure that you have, is that you've included the latest version of constraint layout. So motion layout is packaged as part of the constraint layout package, and you include the latest version at the moment is version 2.0-beta 4. You might want to check that this is still the latest version at the time of watching this video, because it probably is a new release already available. But yeah, so make sure that you've included this. If you're already using constraint layout, you might already have this, but it's worth double checking. And then what you're going to want to do is where you're using constraint layout, you can change this to use the new motion layout. So In the editor, there is actually an option in the design tool to just say right-click, convert to motion layouts. But you can also just edit the XML and change constraint layouts, where it says constraint layout, to change it to say the words motion layout and use this fully qualified widget name. And then what you're going to want to do as well is create a motion scene XML file. So this file is going to contain all the information that drives this animation that you're going to create on your screen. And you need to create this file inside your XML folder in your resources in your app. So once you've created this file, you are then going to want to link this file to the motion layout that you've just changed in your scene or your layout. So in this example, you can see that I have motion layout defined, and the layout description tag, so app layout description, is pointing to an XML file for this specific motion scene. So this is going to link the two together, and actually this is what drives all the animations and puts them all together. The other nice part about motion layouts is a nice debug tool called the show paths. So if you enable tools show paths and you set it to true, when you're running your animation on screen, you will see these nice little lines, like sort of red dotted lines across your layout. And that is the path that all your views will take during this animation. So that's really useful for debugging and just really nice to use and helps write motion scenes a little bit better. Okay, so we've got the sort of basics of what the files we need to have and like where things need to be located. But let's talk a little bit about this motion scene XML class that we've just defined. So this motion scene class or file is an XML file that defines all the animations for that particular scene or for that particular layout. So we want to be able to, we can also define this programmatically, but generally, and all the examples are done with XML at the moment. So at the moment, it's just an XML file, but you can also create this with Kotlin or Java if you wanted to, and create it dynamically if you want. And what a motion scene contains is a bunch of things. So it can get quite confusing if you look at like a really complicated motion scene from the start, but I'd recommend just looking or starting out with your own basic sets and just using these maybe one or two things and get going with that, and then slowly look at the different things that you can add onto it as well. So the first thing is it contains constraint sets. It also contains transitions, and it can also contain keyframes. So these are the ones that I'm going to be focusing on in this talk today. There are, like I mentioned, a bit more that you can do with a motion scene, but we won't dive into too much detail about that because we just want to get started and get our feet a little bit dirty with what we can do with motion scene. So this is typically what a motion scene XML file would look like. We have the top level motion scene tag. We have a transition tag. Inside a transition, we can have a KeyFrameSets. We can also have an on-click listener and an on-swipe if we wanted to. And then we also have the constraint sets. So a motion scene can contain different constraint sets, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a bit. And each constraint set can have a constraint that is applied to a particular view. And that constraint can have different things on it. So things such as like a transformation, a property setting, a layout, or a custom attribute. And we'll go a little bit deeper into that when we get into looking at how we use the motion editor in Android Studio. So the first thing, or let's look at constraint sets and what that actually means inside the motion scene. So a constraint set is what I like to think of as a resting state that the motion scene will take. So we are used to creating constraints when we are creating layouts with constraint layouts. And a constraint set is basically just all those constraints defined within like a set, and they are then being used to either be applied to your layout. So in this example, we have a start and an end constraint set. So this is the different states that we'll have. So at the start of our scene, we are going to set a bunch of different constraints. So maybe it means we are setting the visibility of something to invisible, or maybe we're setting a progress bar to be shown or something like that. And then our end constraint set, we're going to be setting things such as like the visibility is now visible or the progress bar is now gone. And now what will happen is we've got these two different sets and we can now transition between them. So this introduces the transition concept or the transition tag that we would use inside the motion scene. So this defines the way in which two states will be transformed between. So in this example, we have a transition defined in the XML, and we have the constraint set end set to the end state, and the constraint set start set to the start constraint set that we've created. We can also set different things here, such as the duration of this transition, or we can even set the interpolator. So if we wanted to do like a bounce interpolation, or in this example, we're just doing a plain linear interpolation, we can set that on this transition object. And this is the basics that you need in order to run a transition or run this animation in MotionLayout. So we have our two constraint sets, so start and end sets, and then we have our transition that we're going to transition between these two sets. One thing that we can do on a transition is we can define certain behaviors for a transition. So in this example, we are setting an on-click listener, and this automatically adds a transition or invokes the transition on click of a certain target button that we have here. So we just apply or add this on click into the transition object. We set the target to a certain button or view that we have inside our view, inside our layout, and then we say what we want the click action to perform. So in this case, we're saying, okay, this button, when we click it, it must toggle between these two states. So it'll automatically transition between the end and start constraint sets. And if we click it again, it'll go backwards. So it'll go from the end to the start constraint set. And that's what the toggle action will do. So this is pretty much a simple example of what we can do with constraint layout and motion layout and animating between the two. Another deeper kind of thing that we can look at, and we'll show an example in the motion editor, is looking at KeyFrameSets. So this is probably one of my favorite features of motion layout, is this allows you to define different key points of a transition. And it basically assumes that like a timeline of events are happening. So you can assume that at 0, we are starting out our transition, and at point 100 is the end of our transition. So that is the sort of frame positions that we have. And now what I want to do is in my animation, at 60% of my animation, I want to define that my alpha of my button should be fully invisible by that time. So I might have in my start and end constraints set as the alpha starts off as fully visible, and at 100 or at the resting state, the end state, it is set to fully invisible. But my animation, I actually want that transition to finish a bit earlier. So at 60%, I want it to be fully invisible. So this is kind of how this transition would go. It would go from 0 to 100, and at 60% of this animation, the button would already be fully invisible. And then for the rest of that duration of the animation, from 60 to 100, the button would be fully invisible, but it has already happened between 0 and 60. So this is kind of builds up a really massive superpower that you get when you work with these views and animations, because now this allows you to sort of trigger certain things at different points in your animation. So if you wanted to have a button that starts off and that's not visible, and then something else comes in at a certain time and something else goes off the screen at a certain time, using KeyFrameSets and key attributes and key positions, you can do that quite easily with this sort of concept of the timeline and the frames that we have to work with. So these are like the key sort of concepts of using motion layout. So we have our constraint sets, our transitions, and maybe a little bit deeper is KeyFrameSets. So once we've got these sort of like blocks of information in our minds, we can actually go and look at how we use the motion editor. So in Android Studio 4 Beta, there is now a new UI tool for editing and previewing motion scene files. And this makes it extremely powerful and a lot easier to work with motion layout and actually make and build these awesome scenes within Android Studio. Like I mentioned, this is, however, only for Android Studio 4.0 Beta. So there are, to be expected, a couple of bugs, but working with motion scene and motion layouts is way, way easier than actually writing up all that XML that we just looked at. But I believe it is important to understand and know that XML, because at some point you're probably going to run into a bug maybe, and you probably want to edit this XML and actually know what you're doing in the XML, and merely just use the editor to create and adjust things a little bit easier and preview your animations. So it's still important to know exactly how the editor works, how the XML works, but we can actually dive into, let's look at how we can use this editor and make things really great within Android Studio itself. So let's dive in. Okay, so let's have a look at how we go about creating a new motion scene in Android Studio. So the first thing we're going to want to do is create a new scene. So we're going to say activity motion scene new, just for my own sake. And we can, at this point, we can just say it's a constraint layout. And we are going to now right-click on this constraint layout and say convert to motion layout. We are now going to say, yes, I do want to actually, this new motion scene, because it automatically creates this motion scene file, we can now add that also. Obviously, we want to add that to Git, and it's also now created this motion scene file for us. So you can see now this motion scene already contains our constraint sets. So it contains the start and the end one and this transition that we already spoke about. So let's have a look at this editor that we've now got. So now when we enter into this mode in Android Studio, when we have a motion layout, you will see that now we get this new sort of like editor on the side that we can look at. So this actually defines all the different states that we have. So we have our start in ConstraintSets and the transition. So if you click on this, this is the transition between the two. And this is like the base motion layout state that we're going to be working with. So in our layout, we currently have nothing, but I'm going to just add an image view so that we can work with it. And we're going to just set it to an image that we have already. And in my base motion layout state, I'm going to make sure that I've got that selected and select this image view. And I'm just going to give it a size of 50 dp and a height of 50 dp. A bit small. Let's actually make it a bit bigger. Where did it go? 100 dp and 100 dp. Okay, so now we have our image view. It's not constrained at the moment in this base motion layout. So we're going to actually add some constraints. So I'm going to constrain it to the side and the top. So now you can see we've got these two constraint sets. Let's add a bit of padding so we can see it a bit better. Great, so now we have these two constraint sets that we've got. And the image view is constrained to the top left corner of the screen. So what we want to do in this animation is we want to actually animate this image view from the top to the bottom corner. So what we're going to do is in our end constraint set, we're going to select this as our end state. And we want to be making sure that we're editing the constraints on this state and not on the motion layout or the start, because this is applying the constraints to the certain state. So what I'm going to do now is actually select this end state and select this image view. And then I'm going to drag, get these drag handles. I think this motion layout is set to, let's just have a look. It's set the width of the whole thing. So let's just set this to match parent and match parent. Look at it again. And this we wanted to set to 100 dp and 100 dp. Okay, so let's go back to the design view. That's exactly what I wanted now. So now we have this end state, and we want to actually remove these two constraints, and we want to constrain this side and this side to the top and bottom, the top and side of it. So let's make sure we've selected end state, and then drag that to the side and drag it to the bottom. And we're going to delete these two constraints, so the top and the side constraints. And now we've got these two set on it. We also just want to make sure that the width is still set at 100, 100, and we're going to go back to the scene and see what's happened here. Width is 100. That should also be 100. So now we can see inside our inside the design, we have the start and the end sets. And the start constraints, basically, if you don't specify any constraints, it takes everything from this base constraint set that you've defined in your layout. So we didn't need to define any constraints because the start state is what we've defined in motion layout. But we could, if we wanted to, define the constraints here and then change them for the end state as well. So now we have these two states, and now we want to transition between these two, and we want to actually see what happens when these two transition. So this is where the real power of the motion layout editor comes in. So you can now actually play this transition inside Android Studio. So now you can see when I press the play button, it's actually animating between these two constraint sets. And you can see this even in the slide animation on this arrow here, and it shows you exactly at what point in this animation it's going through. You can also speed it up if you wanted to, make it a bit faster, or slow it down if you actually wanted to see it happening a little bit slower. So this is the basics of a motion scene. So we actually have now an animation that is animating a view between the start and end state. And you can see that it wasn't actually that much code that we had to write. So we didn't actually write much code, we just used XML. So in our base motion layout, we have just an image view with some width and height and constraints set on it. And then in our motion scene XML file, we have the start and end constraints. And the end constraint that was generated is now to constrain this view to the bottom and the end of this parent. And we are also just setting the height. We can also just make the height smaller if we actually wanted to animate it to be a smaller size as well. And that will automatically be handled for us. And we can preview it here in the design view as well. So if I make this a bit slower, now you can see it's actually also making this view smaller as it goes. And that's basically all we needed to do in order to get this motion scene to trigger or to happen. So if we wanted to actually have like an automatic, maybe on click of this image view, we want to automatically do this transition, we can do that by adding a click or swipe handler that we have. So if we add this or click on it, we can add a click handler. We specify the transition that we wanted to run, so the start to end transition, and the view that we want to click on is the image view, and the action will just be added onto this. So now we can see if we've clicked on this transition, we can see we have an on-click that's been added, and the target ID is the image view. And if we have a look at our motion scene, we've now also got this on-click listener that's added as well. And we can obviously add a bit more things if we wanted to, like that toggle if we wanted to go from end to start. But you can add these sort of click handlers or swipe listeners in XML and or with this editor using that plus button, and you will automatically get that transition. So let's talk a little bit about the KeyFrameSets and that nice feature that we looked at a little bit in the presentation. So if we wanted to, maybe at some point of this animation, we wanted to set this view to have a bigger scale. So we wanted to, like, as transitions in the middle of this, go a little bit bigger and then go smaller again towards the end. We can do that by adding something to this transition where we click on this little Create Keyframes button. And we can set a key attribute, we can set a key position. Like I mentioned, there's a bunch of different things that you can add onto this, or like for a certain keyframe. But at this point, we just want to use an attribute because we want to change the scale of this item. So we add a key attribute. We say we want it to be on this image view, and at position 50, so halfway through the animation, we want to animate the scale X. So we want to scale it bigger. So now we've seen this item is in here. We also want to just change this scale to be 2 times the size. And now we can also add, let's just add another one for the X and Y. Image view 2, scale X, position 50, add. And now we've got this one as well, and we want to make the scale 2 as well. Okay, so now we can actually pull and drag this whole transition and see exactly what's happening as it goes along. And you can see at that sort of midway point, this view is like double the size that it was when it started, right? You can see now it's like quite a lot bigger, and then it transitions, it becomes a lot smaller again as well. And we can play this animation and see this sort of cool effect that it's created. So starting out small, scaling up, and then getting smaller. And this is basically just done with a keyframe. So let's have a look at what it created for us in XML. So we have this keyframe set that's defined inside this transition object, and we have set a key attribute. So the key attribute is on that image view that we've created. It is taking up at frame position 50, so halfway through the animation, and we are setting the scale X to be double the size that it was. And the same thing for the scale Y of this image view. So you can do other things such as like alpha animations, or if you're using positioning, you can now like change its position to be a little bit off, so it can go like off the path that it was traveling on. And you can do a bunch of really complicated things using like key cycles and keyframe triggers, which we won't go into in this presentation because they're a little bit deeper into what MotionLayout can do, and maybe not so necessary if you're just trying to get started with it. So that's basically looking at the basics of motion layout. If you wanted to add a few more constraint sets, so you could either just go into XML and create a new constraint set by creating it there, Or you can use the Motion Editor and you can actually add and say, create a new constraint set. So if I wanted to say, this is going to be the final image states, I like to name them states, so that's what I think they're kind of based on. And at this point, you can also base a constraint set on a certain previous constraint set that you've defined. So by default, it's defining it on top of the base motion layouts constraints that we've defined, but I can also base it on certain things. So if I want to take all the constraint sets that are set in the start constraint set and plus a few more, I can base my constraint set on top of the start constraint set if I wanted to. But in this case, I can just say I want the motion layout. So now you'll see another state is added to this little editor that we have over here. And if we wanted to define transitions between the two, so say in this state I wanted to go, maybe this is like an intermediate progress state, or maybe it's just like a different end state for something, I can also define in this editor a transition between these states. So I can add, by this clicking on this button, I can give this a new name, so I could transition start final image state. And we're going to go from the start state is start and the end state is final image state. And you can also automatically do certain things if you wanted to, but for now we'll just add it like this. And now we've got this start and final image, final image state transition that we've defined. So let's actually change some stuff in the final image state. So in this state, I actually wanted to go to the bottom, nothing too complex for this example. Wanted to go to the bottom, and I want to remove this constraint at the top. So now it's just animating to the bottom. So that's the final image state, and the start state is at the top. Now if I'm going to transition between the two, I can actually click on this transition, and I can watch this animation happen in place. So really, really easy way to add different animations. You can obviously add a bunch of different things like image views, text views. You can animate pretty much anything. And you can add, and I mean, these can get as complex as you want to make them. But the basics are that you have these sort of states that you have in your motion layout that are defined. And you have transitions between these states, so they can go back or forth, or you can define multiple transitions if you want to. You can have automatic clicks that transition between these two states, so you can automatically go and do this animation. And also what we learned is on these animations or on these transitions, we can set certain key things that will happen during that transition. So in this case, it's a scale up and a scale down at 50% of the animation, but we can do a multitude of different things. We can sort of like at the start of the animation, make sure something is complete, and then towards the end, do something completely different with some other elements on screen. And that's how you can build up those sort of complex animations that we saw at the start of this presentation, where we have a bunch of views coming into the screen, and then at the end, one view pops up and like lands inside at a later point in the whole transition that's happening. And that's pretty much the basics of using motion layout. So I hope this video really helped you learn something, and I look forward to seeing and hearing what you've built with motion layout. So feel free to send me images or videos of what you've made, and tag me on Twitter @Rigaroo. I really like seeing what people have made with their creations or with some of the videos that they've learned from me. And that's it. So thank you very much.